is on remotely as well.
Other thing we can do is
Yeah, and Aaron and James are coming in remotely. So should be all right. Where would y'all like? I don't want to be in your way.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started. Thanks so much for coming to the PhD PhD candidate, Sara Hamilton. So glad you all could be here, and also everyone who's online as well. Sarah's co-advised by myself. I'm Kirsten Nerd-Colbert, integrated biology, and Bruce. And we just wanted to kick it off with some appreciation of Sara. So I first met Sara when she contacted me. At the time, she was a fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. She was doing some GIS work in the Stellwagen National Sanctuary. And that's why she reached out to me and she said, I'm really interested in writing a proposal for a GRFP. And we talked, we got to know each other. She wrote that proposal. She got that GRFP, and that's what brought her here to Oregon. Sara, as you all well know, is a big thinker. So her ideas expanded well beyond that GRFP. In fact, that's not exactly what she ended up doing. But it's been an awesome ride, and Sara has accomplished a lot. So you're going to hear a lot today about her science. And of course, we're going to advance the slides. So, of course, her science is super impressive. Among the many things that she's done is actually jump into the water and do subtidal work here in Oregon, which speaking from someone else who also jumps in the water is no small feat. And it's just been phenomenal to see her develop that skill set and the research questions around it. But you're going to hear a lot about her science, but I want to make sure that you also hear about more. There we go. Her policy work. So when Sara reached out to me, she said, you know, I really want to do user-inspired science, science that makes a difference, science that's going to be applied. And you've done such a phenomenal job of that. While she's been at OSU, she received a Catherine S. McCarter Graduate Student Policy Award, which is from the Ecological Society of America. And that was just earlier this year. So if this were normal times, quote unquote, you would have been going to the Hill, you would have been meeting with policymakers. Sara did that all virtually via Zoom, but no less impressive to be able to get that training, the recognition of the importance of her work, and to do that there. Sara also has received a number of awards and grants while she's been here, but two that are related to policy. She has 2 grants from the Nature Conservancy and has collaborated with them over these past years. And one was to look at the sunflower seed star, which you'll hear more about today, which ended up with some really important and exciting results that she'll also share, and how that relates to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List process, and also to look at kelp forests and how we can best manage them in an ecosystem setting. So she's done a ton of policy work and also a ton of science communication. So I just wanted to recognize that Sara has really invested in getting her science out there. She's given a number of talks at the Oregon Zoo. She did a podcast. She's an active member of the Oregon Kelp Alliance and the Alaka Alliance. And so, Sara, you've just done such phenomenal work, and you won't have time to talk about it all today. So I wanted to make sure we have that opportunity. Great to have you as a colleague. And Bruce, you get to speak too as a.
I have a few words. Yeah, Sara contacted me as well when she was looking around for graduate schools, and expressed interest in co-advising with Kirsten, which I was happy to do. I've had a number of colleagues, and when I spoke with her, she asked about working subtitly, and I said, well, you know, in Oregon, kind of hard to do, hard to get in the water reliably and so forth. But of course, she went ahead and did it anyway, and she shows what I know. And the other bit of news is that Sarah, I think, I worked out with Jenna, that she was my 45th PhD student. So, thrilled to have her here today and telling us about what she's done. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, you too. Kirsten mentioned that I reached out to her to write a GRFP, but I'm not sure if Kirsten realizes how much she contributed to that GRFP being successful. I don't know if it would have been funded without all the time that Kirsten put into helping me develop that, you know, as a student who wasn't even at that point committed to working in our lab. So both Bruce and Kirsten gave me an amazing platform to come here and do my science and be the independent researcher that I wanted to be. And yeah, all of this is because of the platform that they gave me. So I thank them so much for that. Let's see here. Okay, Ricardo, are we looking good? Awesome. Okay, before we get started today here, I'd like to just acknowledge that this talk today is located within the traditional homelands of the Mpenafu Band of the Kalapuya peoples. Following the Kalapuya Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya peoples were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon. And today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. So thank you all so much for being here today. This is my thesis defense, and the title of which is Drivers of Kelp Force Responses to Global Change, from Populations to Policies. So to give you a little roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll start with a little kelp forest specific background, because who doesn't need more kelp in their life? I'll dive into chapter 1 of my research, which focused on satellites and kelp. I'll go to chapter 2, which looked at the spatial ecology of a marine epidemic. Chapter 3, ecosystem-based management for kelps. And then I'm going to step back from the formal research and talk a little bit about connecting my science with policymaking and conservation here in Oregon. And then we'll wrap up with some lessons learned at the end. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, to a glorious pre-pandemic time known as 2017. So this is actually a picture of me on my very first day of my PhD. And I've got this big grin on my face, but I can guarantee you that what I'm really thinking is, I have no idea what I'm doing, and this is absolutely terrifying. And so while I wrote a GRFP with Kirsten about larval rockfish ecology, Bruce and Kirsten both gave me a platform to be they told me I could kind of study anything I wanted. And so I did a lot of experimenting. I went out in the intertidal with the Mingi lab to check out their work. I went smurfing with Kirsten's crew to learn about juvenile rockfish. I did a little work on marine protected areas with Jane and Kirsten. And then I went to the big ESA conference in 2017, and I saw this talk right here, titled Novel Insights into Metapopulation Theory Through Long-Term Study of Giant Kelp Forests. And this talk by Max Castorani was the first thing that really piqued my interest in kelp forests and kind of got me asking questions about, well, they did this in California, could we do this here? And it's just funny to think that this one talk was really kind of what precipitated the rest of what ended up becoming my PhD. So I wanted to highlight that. Anyways, let's dive in and talk about kelp. So first, I just want to make it clear, what is a kelp after all? So kelps are large brown marine seaweeds. They photosynthesize like plants do, live in cool, shallow waters, and line about a quarter of the world's coastlines. And you can see some of the diversity of the different forms they take in these pictures here. This one is my favorite. It's called bull kelp, and you'll hear a lot more about it. So that's what a kelp is, but why do we study it? Why have I spent 4 years of my life doing this work? Well, for me, it's because of all the cool benefits that kelps provide, not only to critters around them, but also to human communities. Kelps are habitat for many critters that want to come hide and live amongst the 3D structure that they provide. So they act as a biodiversity attractor. They're a rich source of nutrition for lots of critters like tegula snails, urchins, abalone, some kinds of fish. Not only are they a rich source of nutrition within the limits of the kelp forest itself, but when kelp is dislodged from its rocky substrate and it ends up drifting away to the deep sea or to beaches, it actually exports, that's the word, it exports that biomass to other ecosystems that can be nutrient limited. And so it actually ends up subsidizing other ecosystems as well. They support a number of important fisheries, including the commercial and recreational fisheries for salmon and rockfish, as well as urchins and abalone, and kelps themselves are harvested for a number of different uses. They can be important sites of recreation, tourism, and cultural values for many people. This is a picture of my partner snorkeling with me in the Port Orford kelp forest, in one of the Port Orford kelp forests. And then finally, this is one that we're still trying to figure out, but scientists think that they can be a potentially important source of carbon sequestration, which essentially just means that kelps, as photosynthesizers, can suck so much carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in their tissues. And if after the kelp dies, that those kelp tissues get stored either down in the deep sea where they're buried, or that carbon gets transferred to a long-living organism, then that can actually represent substantial sequestration of carbon out of the atmosphere and stored somewhere else where it's not contributing to climate change. So all of these services have real impacts on human communities. And when a recent study in California found that an economic evaluation of all these different services totaled up to kelps being worth about $260 million a year to California. We don't have those numbers for Oregon, but you can see this makes a real impact on people's lives. So let's transition to thinking about kelps in the face of global change. So what do kelps need to thrive? Well, as photosynthesizers, they need light, and so they need clear water that light can penetrate. They need cool water because kelps are fundamentally temperate and polar species. They like the cold. They need clean water that has the right balance of nutrients, not too many, not too few. They need to have not too many grazers around. Grazers like urchins or tegula snails can eat down so much kelp that it never gives them a chance to grow and really decimate a kelp forest. And then finally, they need to have a balanced set of food web interactions and species interactions around them that allow them to thrive. And so with human impacts accelerating over the last 50 years, things like overfishing, climate change, and coastal development, kelps are threatened because they struggle with things like ocean warming, pollution, invasive species, and urchin overgrazing. Unfortunately, worldwide, with these increasing human impacts, we've seen collapses of kelp forests all over the world. This is just a limited survey of the places that there have been really dramatic declines. And you can see from Norway to Australia to Chile. So this is something, a global problem of kelp forest decline and collapse. And unfortunately, we've seen an example of this pretty close to home. In about 2015, the bull kelp forests in Northern California collapsed. We think this was in response to a perfect storm of bad conditions, things like a marine heat wave, loss of a top urchin-eating predator, and then a bunch of new baby urchins being recruited. And they lost about 90% of their bull kelp forest in like a year. This led to the closure of commercially important red abalone and red urchin fisheries. And now 5 or 6 years later, there still hasn't been much recovery. There's no sign that they're bouncing back quickly. And so I think that kind of obviously leads to the question of, oh shoot, what's happening here in Oregon? How are our kelp forests doing? And so those were some of the things that I was thinking about when I saw that talk by Max Castorani about kelp forests in California. And as I started poking around and trying to understand what we knew about kelp forests in Oregon, I realized that they were really understudied. ODF&W had done a few aerial surveys of kelp, mostly back in the 1990s. But other than that, we really didn't have any kind of data documenting how they were changing over time, what was driving those changes, what species interactions were important for them. And so we just didn't know much. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. First off, as Kirsten alluded to, it's very hard, Kirsten and Bruce both, it's very hard to dive in Oregon. The waters are stormy, the waves are big, the water is cold, and it is dark. And so historically, there just weren't all that many people in the water diving, taking data on kelps. Whoops, that's okay. Additionally, there are some really well-studied kelp species like giant kelp, which is the dominant one down in California, and you see it on all those David Attenborough documentaries. But the dominant canopy-forming species here in Oregon is actually this species right here, bull kelp. And it's much less studied. There hadn't been a lot of studies done anywhere on bull kelp. So it wasn't like we could draw on science that had been done other places to try to understand how bull kelp in Oregon was doing. And then finally, you can find kelp all up and down Oregon's coastline, but particularly for bull kelp for these canopy-forming forests, probably about 80% of Oregon's bull kelp forests are found in the southern third of the state. You can see this map here, kind of Cape Arago southwards down towards the California border. And this is just a really sparsely populated part of the coastline. And so I think historically, there just weren't as many people around using the kelp forests, studying them, advocating for them. And so they weren't really raised to the level of public awareness in Oregon's public imagination. And so that's where I kind of came in around 2017, feeling like we were really behind on what we needed to understand about these cool, important ecosystems. So based on the information I've given you so far, where does my work fit in to all this background information? And so I wanted to study what's driving kelp forest responses to global change. And that's a really complex topic that involves a lot of different factors. And so I kind of came at it with that in mind. On the natural science end of the spectrum, I started by, in chapter 1, studying population dynamics of kelp in Oregon. Chapter 2, studying the impacts of an epidemic on a key sea star species. But then I also tried to come at it more from the human science end of the spectrum too. Over here on the right, chapter 3 focused on how do we humans manage kelp forests, because the way humans are interacting with kelp forests matters. It's a critical part of the ecosystem. And so it may seem that the topics that I'm talking about are kind of all over the place, but I think that reflects the nature of the problem, which is multifaceted and complex. So if you'll permit me a sip of water. So let's go ahead and dive into the research that I did. And so this first chapter focused on using satellites to understand changes in bull kelp cover over the last 35 years in Oregon. You're gonna do it? There we go. And so I think it's kind of clear what the motivation for this study was. We were looking to see if this untapped data set, satellite imagery, could be used to try to fill in some of these gaps we had in our understanding of kelp forest here in Oregon. And so the key questions for this chapter were, could we use the satellite data, Landsat data, to make a long-term time series of kelp cover changes in Oregon? And if we could, then what were the long-term changes in kelp cover? How are they changing over time? Did we see a collapse in kelp cover in 2015 in Oregon the way that they had in Northern California, just to the south? And what were some potential environmental drivers that were associated with good kelp years and bad kelp years? So I always think this part is amazing. If I were in your position, I would be thinking to myself, what the heck is she talking about? Why is she going on about satellites and kelp? What do these have in common? And it turns out that kelp forests are so dang big that you can actually see them from space. And so that talk that I referenced, that talk by Max Castorani that first got me interested in kelp forest work, was actually using I was using satellite data, specifically Landsat data, to track changes in California's giant kelp forests. And so Landsat is a satellite that was launched by NASA back in the 1980s. And ever since then, it's been continuously orbiting the planet and taking pictures of the surface of the planet. And so these are some Landsat, they're called tiles, Landsat tiles here. And once you take out all the red, which is the land, and all this blue water, you're left with these big clumps of kelp lining the coastline. And so researchers in California had been using this for a few years when I saw this talk. But the problem, or the question for us was, so remember, California, they were using this on giant kelp, but we have a lot of bull kelp. This isn't quite as clear as I wanted it to be, but these are drone images of giant kelp on the top and bull kelp on the bottom. And what you can see is giant kelp has a lot of its tissues, a lot of its fronds up on the surface of the water. I kind of think of it as like splaying out melodramatically along the surface. Whereas bull kelp, it doesn't hold all of its fronds up at the surface. And so it's a bit hard to see, but it's kind of more like pinpricks of kelp as opposed to the splaying across the surface. And satellites can't look into the water. They can only see what's on top of the water. So there was a real question whether Landsat was going to be useful at all for bull kelp. And so that was the first thing that we had to figure out. Could we even use this data set? So moving on to results, what is it that we actually found? The first thing we found was that, yes, you could use Landsat to track bull kelp in Oregon. And so this is a Landsat tile. It's black and white because it hasn't had any color corrections to it. The white is the land down around the Port Orford area. Black is seawater. And this kind of grayish shadow that you can see off the coast here is actually the Orford Reef kelp forest, which historically was one of the biggest kelp forests in all of Oregon. And so Landsat could pick up these little pinpricks of bull kelp at the surface and give us some good insight into how big the kelp forest was at this point in time. And since Landsat goes back to the 1980s, that meant that we could retroactively create a 35-year time series of how kelp was changing in Oregon, which is a pretty amazing thing to be able to suddenly stumble upon a 35-year time series. So from this time series, our first question was, how were our forests changing since the 1980s? And we found that they were indeed changing across Oregon, but that there was a lot of local scale variability. They weren't changing consistently. So for instance, at kelp forests around Cape Arago, they've been pretty steady since the 1980s. They weren't changing much. Around the Port Orford area, a lot of the kelp forests looked like they had been declining for a long time. But then down by Rogue Reef, which is right outside of Gold Beach, those kelp forests have actually been increasing in cover over the last 20 years or so. And so there wasn't a consistent trend across the state. You had to kind of look at each individual reef. What about that 2015 collapse that we saw in Northern California? Well, what you can see here is an example of one reef here in Oregon. This is Rogue Reef, which is right outside of Gold Beach. From 2011 to 2019, you can see this is the 2015, that pivotal year. And this is kelp cover. So how big was the dang kelp forest? And what you can see is after 2015, it actually only went up at Rogue Reef. And this is something that we saw at several reefs across Oregon, several of the really important ones. In the years immediately after 2015, they were actually doing quite well. And so while there were some forests that took hits after 2015, we definitely didn't see the same kind of region-wide synchronized collapse that they saw in Northern California. Please. And then when we took these time series and we used generalized linear models to correlate changes in kelp cover with environmental variables like temperature, wave height, climate oscillations, we found some pretty interesting things. We found that in some ways, our kelp forests here in Oregon actually act a lot like the ones down in California. So for example, if you look at the relationship with El Nino, we found that in El Nino years, there was less bull kelp in Oregon. So there was a negative correlation between El Nino and bull kelp cover. And that's really similar to what they've seen in California for a long time. However, in a number of other really important ways, our kelp forests actually acted very differently. So for instance, we found this positive correlation between wave height and kelp cover, which basically means particularly in the winter, the bigger the waves were in the winter, the more kelp you would get the following spring. And this is the exact opposite of what they often talk about in what was known from California at the time, which was big waves tend to come through and rip kelp up off the substrate and really decimate the forest. So that was the exact opposite for us. Additionally, when you looked at the relationship between kelp cover and seawater nutrient concentration, there we go. We saw a negative relationship. And again, that's the exact opposite of what these really well-studied forests down in California saw, which was in California, when there was more nutrients, there was more kelp. Whereas here in Oregon, years that had a lot of nutrients in the water, it wasn't a very good year for kelp. And so we found, we were discovering that bull kelp can act very differently than giant kelp can. And then in general, Oregon's kelp forests were going to be driven by factors that were likely to be very different than those in California. You couldn't just pick up lessons you had learned in California and apply them to Oregon. So if you would like to dig into more of the technical details on this chapter, I encourage you to go check out the manuscript, which is published in Ecology under the title Remote Sensing, Generation of Long-Term Kelp Bed Datasets for Evaluation of Impacts of Climatic Variation. So now we'll go ahead and dig into chapter 2. So this chapter focused on the impacts of a marine epidemic on sunflower sea stars and implications for their recovery. And this was one of the chapters that I received substantial funding and intellectual support from the Nature Conservancy. And so you may be thinking, why are you talking about sea stars, Sarah? You just spent all this time telling us about how cool kelp was. I thought you were talking about kelp, and now you're talking about sea stars. Well, I'm not just talking about any sea star. I'm talking about the sunflower sea star, also known as Pycnopodia helianthoides. And we think that these sea stars can be important to kelp forests because they can eat a lot of urchins. In fact, in some places, when scientists remove sunflower sea stars from a kelp forest, you get these increasing numbers of urchins that are out and about on the reef grazing down kelp, and you see less kelp. So we were interested in sunflower sea stars specifically because of the indirect effects that they can have on kelp forests. But this potentially important predator was very negatively impacted by the infamous sea star wasting disease epidemic that swept through West Coast sea star populations starting in about 2013. So our key questions for this chapter were, did the timing of the epidemic, so how quickly it moved, when it hit, did that vary across the range of the sunflower sea star? Did the severity of the epidemic vary across the range of the sunflower sea star? Were there any environmental correlates to the severity? So places with X environmental conditions got it worse or better. And finally, that pandemic began to power down around 2016-ish. And so we were curious, have we seen any evidence of recovery in these populations yet? And so I'm very excited to get a moment to just introduce you more deeply to the sunflower sea star because they are incredible critters. They are one of the largest sea stars in the entire world and can grow to be more than a yard in diameter. They have more than 20 arms and are a generalist predator, which means that they can eat a lot of different things. But as I mentioned, they can predate on urchins. And when they do that in heavy numbers, that can provide this positive top-down effect on kelps and allow kelps to thrive a little bit more. And importantly, they were hit by this sea star wasting epidemic, this mysterious marine disease that swept across the entire West Coast starting in 2013-ish. I do want to note that I told my parents I was studying sea stars, and I think they were thinking of little cute 5-armed things. And after like a year of studying them, I finally showed them a picture, and they were just horrified. They didn't have anything to say. Their just mouths were open. They did not recognize it as a sea star. So I kind of almost think of them as sea monsters in my head, but really amazing, wonderful sea monsters. So as a note in terms of the ecology and how they interact with kelp forests, over here, you see the range of the sunflower sea star, which goes from the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska all the way down to Mexico. Okay, and so this was pre-sea star wasting. And also up here, I put the ranges of other major urchin-eating predators. So we're talking sea otters in brown, sheep's head wrasse in dark blue, and spiny lobster in red. And what you can kind of see is that for large chunks of the West Coast, and remember there's kelp forests growing all up and down this West Coast, for large chunks of the West Coast, think central British Columbia, Oregon, and Northern California, before the epidemic, sunflower sea stars were really the only major urchin predator around, which meant that if you were going to lose them, you would lose any kind of top-down control on urchin populations, and that could potentially have important impacts for kelp forests. Let's see. So how do we answer those key questions that I laid out in the beginning? We basically reached out to anyone we could think of in North America that we knew were doing seafloor surveys. And we asked them, do you ever see sunflower stars? Do you note them in your surveys? And we got back over 48,000 surveys from more than 34 data contributors. And these surveys spans the entire range, all the way from down in southern Baja California, all the way up through the Aleutian Islands. These data were contributed by government scientists, community scientists, university scientists, all these cool different collaborators that we got to work with. And overall, pulling this together probably took about 5 months. So it was a really substantial undertaking. But these data, these surveys that we collected, some of them go all the way back to the 1980s. And so we were able to get a snapshot of what sunflower sea star populations looked like before wasting, and then compare that to after wasting to answer those key questions that we had. So what was the answer to those four key questions that I posed? The first was, how did the timing of this epidemic vary across this whole range from Mexico to Alaska? And what we found was that the epidemic hit earlier and it moved through the populations faster in the southern half of the range. So the southern half of the range, we're talking outer coast of Washington down through Mexico. Once you got further north into Canada and Alaska, though, it didn't hit until much later, maybe 2015, 2016 even, and it moved much more slowly through the populations. We saw the densities of sunflower sea stars decline much more slowly. So there was some kind of latitudinal gradient in the timeline of this epidemic. And that second question was, across the range, how did the epidemic severity vary? And again, we were seeing these latitudinal gradients where in the southern half of the range, this was a really catastrophic event. We found a 99% reduction in the densities of sunflower stars. And we ended up labeling in the southern half sunflower stars as being functionally extinct, which for us meant that, yeah, you may still find them occasionally, but they're not playing any kind of meaningful ecological role. Their numbers are so depressed. And we're worried about the viability of the population. We're worried about there being enough around to continue the population into the future. However, when you hit about the Puget Sound and you started moving northwards, there was only an 80 to 90% reduction in sunflower sea star populations. And so it's very patchy up there. A lot of places, sunflower stars were wiped out, but there are places, for instance, in like the fjords of British Columbia, where we've had collaborators tell us they see 12 adult full-size Pycnopodia on a single transect. So they were still dramatically impacted in the northern half of the range, but there's still meaningful populations in little pockets here and there. And so this sets up an interesting gradient. It's interesting to think about in terms of the natural history. Why do we see this gradient? But also that it added a lot of information for us about how do we go about trying to recover this species when you've got differences in how bad the epidemic was in certain places. Third question was about environmental correlates to severity. And so the way that we looked at that is we took those 48,000 data points and we fed them into 2 species distribution models. And so species distribution models basically just give us an idea of, based on the environmental data at this specific point, temperature, salinity, chlorophyll levels, how likely are you to find a sunflower sea star? And so you can see some of the variables we included: salinity, chlorophyll, depth, temperature along the x-axis here. And then the importance of that variable. How important was that variable to actually being able to identify whether there would be a sunflower star there? And so these purple bars represent prior to the sea star wasting epidemic. And what you should know is that depth was by far the most important variable. It explained about 80% of the variability in sunflower sea star population. So across this whole range, the one thing you really needed to know was how deep was it, because you were much more likely to find a sunflower star at about 30 feet depth as opposed to 300. After sea star wasting, though, these red bars, we ran the model again, and what we found was that the importance of depth dropped a good bit, and the importance of temperature rocketed up. It increased more than 5-fold. And so what that was telling us was that now, not only do you need to know how deep your site is to know whether you're going to find sunflower stars there, you need to know what temperature it is, because specifically colder temperatures were where you were going to find them, not warm temperatures. A few other things changed as well. Chlorophyll bumped up a bit, salinity bumped down. But overall, this really strong signal made a lot of sense to us, because there had been a number of lab and field studies prior to this that showed that when the water was warmer, sea star wasting happened more quickly and it was more severe. It was more likely to kill the individual. And so this is kind of continuing evidence that temperature has something to do with just how bad this epidemic got. and may have something to do with these strong latitudinal gradients in timing and severity that we saw for sunflower stars. And then the final question was, if this epidemic, there's a difference between epidemic and pandemic, and I keep saying the wrong one. Since this epidemic began to kind of power down around 2016 or so, it's 2021 now. Have we seen any evidence of populations beginning to bounce back? And what we found, again, were some latitudinal gradients. And we found in the southern half of the range from outer coastal Washington down, they had stabilized, but those population densities had stabilized around 0. So they had kind of flatlined. Whereas in the northern half of the range, we actually found that densities were continuing to trickle down slowly over time. And so we didn't see evidence of recovery anywhere along the range, and maybe even evidence that the epidemic may not be over yet in the northern half of the range, may still be going. And so again, if you'd like to dig into the technical details or learn more about this project, I encourage you to go check out the manuscript, which is published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B. Disease-driven mass mortality event leads to widespread extirpation and variable recovery potential of a marine predator across the Eastern Pacific. Such a long title, I couldn't even say it in one breath. We thought about that title for a long time too. Okay. Then let me make sure I'm caught up on my notes here. And the third chapter that I'm going to talk about today is this one that focuses on ecosystem-based management for kelp forests. And again, this had really significant funding and intellectual support from my collaborators at the Nature Conservancy. And so why talk about ecosystem-based management in relation to kelp forests? Well, when I was going through the scientific literature, trying to understand how do you best manage kelp forests, I found that they appear to be really understudied compared to other important coastal ecosystems. So for things like mangrove forests or coral reefs, you were finding orders of magnitude more data and studies and case studies about how you best manage them than you were for kelp forests. And if kelps are facing, climate change and all these other potential stressors, we really need to understand what are best practices for stewarding our kelp forests and how can humans play a beneficial role in these ecosystems. So my questions for this, whoa, my Lord. Please. Pretty please. There we go. Questions were, what ecosystem-based management practices would we predict would be important for kelps? How is kelp currently managed? And what are some best practices for kelp forest management? Let's see how far it goes. And so we answered these questions using 3 lines of evidence. We started with the literature on kelp forest biology and ecology, because I'm an ecologist. We then also used the literature on ecosystem-based management. And finally, we used case studies of how kelp is actually managed in 3 regions: British Columbia, up in Canada, California, USA, and northern Chile. And we felt this was a pretty holistic approach to studying kelp forest management because we were drawing from all these different sources of expertise. From the kelp forest biology and ecology literature, we were bringing in biological intuition about how these systems actually work. From the EBM literature, we were drawing on the well-developed science of how do you manage ecosystems. And then using our case studies, we were trying to draw inspiration from reality and look at what creative problem solving was going on on the ground and what seemed to be working. Now, unfortunately, for the sake of time, I'm not actually going to be able to answer all 3 of these questions. So I'm just going to focus on the one that I think was the most impactful. What are some best practices for kelp forest management? And so we identified 6 potential best practices that we suggest people keep in mind when they are managing their kelp forests. That first one is monitoring at scales that are biologically relevant in time and space. And so this principle draws on the fact that kelp forests can change really quickly. In fact, I would say they're uniquely dynamic ecosystems. And we all know that monitoring ecosystems is important, but monitoring kelp forests, because they can change so quickly, ideally would require widespread annual to sub-annual monitoring, which is really hard to do. That's asking a lot. But we saw a good example of how you can do this successfully in British Columbia, where they've recently set up a regionally coordinated kelp forest monitoring program. And so this program utilizes diverse institutions ranging from universities to First Nations Guardian Watchman programs to conduct a tiered program of information gathering using different survey types. So they're using kayak surveys, they're using scuba surveys, they're using drone surveys, all being conducted to collect kelp forest data based on the needs and the logistic capacity in each part of British Columbia. And by working with diverse partners and diverse survey types, this program is greatly increasing the temporal and spatial scale of kelp forest monitoring in British Columbia. Our second principle was assessing and addressing cumulative impacts. And so this kind of draws on the fact that kelps are almost never challenged by one stressor. They very often have 2, 3, 4, 5 stressors that are impacting them. So for example, in northern Chile, the enormous kelp harvesting industry there is oftentimes seen as the most important or the biggest challenge to the persistence of kelp forests there. However, there are a lot of other documented stressors as well, including extreme overfishing of urchin-eating fish, water pollution, and climate change. And all of these things are going to be acting synergistically. They're going to be interacting with one another, these stressors are. And so you need to be considering all of them when you're trying to think about what threats are we trying to mitigate? How do we manage this system? Our third principle that we identified was managing across spatial and administrative scales. And so this draws on the idea of polycentricity, which shows that having nested levels of governance, reaching from local governance all the way up to international governance, can increase the resilience of managed systems. An example of how to manage with this principle in mind would be the way that California managed water quality problems that they were facing back in the 1950s through about the 1970s. So at that time, really extreme coastal development in areas like San Diego and LA were creating such water quality problems that they were impacting kelp forests negatively. And so to address this, required national level policies like the Clean Water Act of 1972, regional level policies like the areas of biological significance, which are a set of areas across California with stronger water quality requirements, and local scale governance, local scale policies controlling point sources of water contamination, like the kelp-specific monitoring and restoration going on around the San Onofre nuclear generating station. The fourth principle we identified was developing and implementing co-management approaches. So co-management just basically means that you really need to include kelp forest users and rights holders when you're doing management. An excellent example of how to do this can be seen in British Columbia's marine planning process. This is an official agreement between the province of British Columbia and 17 coastal First Nations to co-produce marine spatial planning there. So including the traditional rights holders to those waters in all management decisions. And this formal co-management situation has produced some really tangible benefits for kelp forests, including a policy review of kelp harvesting policies in the region, one of the largest and most rigorous urchin removal experiments ever attempted thus far in North America, and that kelp forest monitoring program that I mentioned earlier. That really cool, innovative program came out of this partnership. The fifth principle that we identified was employing adaptive management and or the precautionary approach. And again, this is hitting on that unique ecological aspect of kelp forests, which is that they are highly dynamic and they can quickly shift into alternative states like urchin barrens. And so if kelp forests can change that quickly, we need management, particularly the management of the kelp harvest, to be able to respond similarly quickly. How do you do that? An example can be seen in northern Chile, where they have this extensive system of territorial user rights fisheries, which are areas where local fisher unions are given the jurisdiction to manage benthic resources in a specific cove. So it's local fishers, not government making specific rules for that area. And when kelp is one of the harvested resources in these turfs, what happens is that every year, the fishers are required to go out and assess how much kelp is left, the status of the population, and make changes to how much harvest is allowed. So you get management adapting to changing kelp conditions every year. And then the final principle that we outlined was managing food web connections. Kelps, particularly in high latitude areas, as I've mentioned, can be really sensitive to changes in populations of herbivores like urchins and things that eat herbivores like sunflower sea stars. This is a key important ecological aspect of kelp forests. So how do we manage with that policy in mind? An example of this is how California has put policies in place over the last 30 years that have really helped to rebuild some of their top predator populations. So we're talking about things like protecting and reintroducing otters, improving fisheries management for sheep's head wrasse and spiny lobsters, and of course, putting in place their signature MPA network. Furthermore, in times or places where you just don't have top predators around, urchin removal projects like the ones run by the Bay Foundation out of Palos Verdes kelp forest can make local scale differences to kelp forests. Now, I will, for the kelp forest ecologists out there, note that there's actually a lot of controversy about how strong the top-down effects of predators and urchins are on kelp forests. And there is some variability depending on where you are. So this will be important to many systems, but there are some places where grazing doesn't seem to matter that much. And so this principle will not be as applicable there. And if you'd like further details on this work, I really wanted to tell you, go see the manuscript in marine policy, but unfortunately marine policy has taken their time getting back to us. So it is now in second revision at marine policy, but if you would like to learn more about this particular project, please email me and I can provide you with that manuscript. And keep your fingers crossed that they get back to us on that soon. And so I'd like to take a minute to move away from some of my formal research to talk about another important science project that I've been pursuing during my time at OSU, which has been building momentum for kelp forest stewardship in Oregon. Defenses are usually used to talk about your science and your research, but this public engagement work has been a really important part of my PhD for me. As I mentioned earlier, when I first came to Oregon, it felt to me like nobody was really talking about kelp forests and how they were changing, at least amongst a lot of the environmentalists and scientists and managers that I knew. And so I wanted to do something about that. And so I pursued a lot of different forms of public engagement. I did more than 15 public presentations that reached more than 800 members of the public. I worked with the Nature Conservancy to get the sunflower sea star listed as critically endangered on the international IUCN Red List. I brought cutting edge kelp forest science to otter reintroduction efforts here in Oregon by working with the Alaka Alliance. And this included writing a section for their Oregon otter reintroduction feasibility study. I've become a really key contributor and loving member of the Oregon Kelp Alliance, which is a community-based kelp forest stewardship program based largely in Southern Oregon. As Kirsten mentioned, as an Ecological Society of America Catherine MacArthur Fellow, I was trained in how to communicate scientific issues to state and federal level managers. And I followed this up with several meetings with Oregon Senators Jeff Merkley and Ron Wyden to talk about both science funding and kelp forest specific policies here in Oregon. And so I was doing a lot of this public engagement work, and for a few years, it kind of felt like I was just screaming into the void. And it was like, why am I doing any of this? And then over the last 2 or 3 years, we started to see this incredible new wave of interest in kelp forests. We saw the Oregon Kelp Alliance conducting a community-based urchin removal project at Nellie's Cove to try to restore a locally important kelp forest there, with more than 47,000 urchins cleared. We saw Senator Merkley put $1 million ask for the Oregon Kelp Alliance in a congressional spending bill that we are waiting to hear back on. ODF&W has new money to study kelp and kelp-related species like sunflower stars. The sunflower sea star is actually currently undergoing Endangered Species Act evaluation. And if they were to be listed as an ESA species, that would be federal recognition of their endangered status and would come with certain policy changes and funding. And then additionally, I've just seen all this amazing media coverage from OPB, from Forbes, from other outlets, covering everything from the science of kelp forests to how local chefs are trying to get people to use urchin roe, also known as uni, in their recipes. And so I want to make this really clear that I didn't make any of this happen. These developments were the products of many people working together for years at a time on these issues. And some of these developments I'm only tangentially related to. But I do think that my work and my advocacy here has been this small little part of creating this kind of new wave of interest and stewardship and advocacy for kelp forests in Oregon. And I want to share that with y'all because I think for me, that's probably the most important, or that's the outcome of my PhD that I'm most proud of. And so to begin to wrap up here, I'll stop yapping at y'all. I want to finish with some lessons learned from my 4 or 5 years studying kelp here in Oregon. And so some of these key lessons we've learned are Oregon's kelp forests are not the same as California's kelp forests, and they deserve locally oriented study. Oregon's kelp is struggling in some places, but it's doing well in others. There's a lot of complexity. Sunflower stars are functionally extinct here in Oregon and are likely not playing the ecological role that they used to play. How we manage kelp is an important part of the puzzle. Humans are interacting with kelp forests every day. So let's develop the science of how to do that best. And then finally, a lot of my PhD is focused on spatial variability and how ecological processes work. And I think through that work, I've realized that there really is no magic bullet. There's no single thing that's going to fix all of Oregon's kelps problems. I think through some of my public engagement work, I've realized that the thing that's needed most is local people who care and are willing to advocate and willing to steward and willing to work for their kelp forests. And I've been really lucky to get to learn that lesson. So as I wrap up, as I like to say, it takes a village to complete a PhD. And I've had so many amazing mentors and supporters throughout this process that have contributed tremendously to my development as a scientist and as a person. And have really also played a part in this new wave of kelp forest interest in Oregon. And so I'd like to start off by highlighting the roles my wonderful advisors, Kristen and Bruce, have played over the last 4 or 5 years, giving me that platform to kind of, I don't even know what that process was, just pick up some ideas and run with them and see what happened. Additionally, my pseudo advisor, I would call her Sara, the postdoc in our lab, has played a very important mentorship role for me. I have 3 other amazing committee members that have provided crucial insight and support over the last 4 or 5 years. The crew at University of Oregon and Aaron Galloway's lab quickly treated me like an extra member of the lab and kind of adopted me, which I appreciated so much. The Nature Conservancy has provided so much funding, technical support, intellectual support for these endeavors. Tom Bell provided some really incredible remote sensing expertise. Tom Calapanese, I just want to thank him for all that he is and everything that he does. I've also had so many amazing graduate student mentors that have taught me just as much about science as my elder mentors have. And some of those people, just some of them include Anne Devon Song, Ren Yoshioka, Stephen Johnson, Emily Boring, Maya Fizel, Jesse Laney, John Dickens, and Sunny Winters, and Bailey Moretz. I want to, of course, recognize the decades of sacrifice that my wonderful mom and dad have put into letting me blossom into the person that I am today. I kind of think that my dad initially inspired my love for learning and education, and that my mom inspired my love for nature as a little kid. And then, of course, my 2 main men, Curtis, my partner, who is here today, and Cooper, my dog, who's not here today, unfortunately, but you see this amazing picture of him right there. They've just been there on the ground day in and day out for the last several years, helping me get the damn thing done. And I think I could have completed a PhD without the 2 of them. I could not have completed a PhD during a pandemic without the two of them. So thanks to so many people that have put so much time and energy into me as a person. And with that, I will go ahead and wrap up. I will thank you all so much for listening. And taking your time and energy to let me share my passion for kelp forests and get to the fun part. What questions do you have? What can I elaborate? What can we talk more about, friends? So Ricardo, will you help me keep an eye on the Q&A if anybody has any questions there?
Okay, so I think we have how many minutes?
Well, let's say we have about
Yeah,
5 or
it was
6.
about 5 minutes.
Yeah. Or have you all heard me talk about this stuff so many times now that you're like, we're kelp forest experts, we got it, Sarah. Yeah, Jenna.
Yeah, awesome talk. Super cool work. I was super interested in the differences between the kelp in Oregon and California, and knowing that they're different species. What do you think is going on with the nutrient
Yeah.
situation? And also the other, like, second question to that is, when you're thinking of these like policy and management, like best practices type things, how do those local differences, how do you build those local differences into those type of rules?
Yeah. Yeah, those are great questions. The first one, our best guess right now, so to remind everybody, we found this negative relationship between seawater nutrient level and kelp cover. So more nutrients, less kelp here in Oregon. And based on actually some of the previous work that's been done on the intertidal in Bruce's lab, our kind of best guess for what's going on is that we are so nutrient replete here in Oregon, we never have a problem with there being too many nutrients. But what happens is when there's upwelling, there can be so many nutrients in the system that you get those phytoplankton blooms that end up clouding the water. And then you have the problem of the water is so cloudy that light can't penetrate and provide that other crucial ingredient to kelp growth, light. And so our best guess is kind of that, but it's definitely, it's a tantalizing little nugget that I wish I could pursue further. As far as how do you incorporate these local scale differences, I think there needs to one of the things that I care about a lot is having local scale experts, whether those are scientists or tribal members or kelp forest users in individual places that have that really deep fine scale understanding of one particular place that can be allowed to be at the table and kind of talk about what matters there in their community, as opposed to, you know, wherever the decisions are being made, whether that's Portland or DC or where else. So that's a bigger question than I'm probably prepared to answer, but I think building up local scale, recognizing the expertise that is already there, building up expertise where there is less, and then inviting those local scale stakeholders to the conversation, I think are important pieces of that. Mhm. Yeah, Ricardo.
A few questions on the chat, well, on the Q&A in front of you. So the first one, it says, incredible presentation. What methodology or data management system did you use to consolidate all 48,000 signal surveys? That's a lot to collect and process in 5 months.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. That was, Sarah Graham knows that was quite the, made a lot of mistakes there. So the basic process that I think one of the biggest challenges was not only we were getting data from all these different collaborators, but the data was always in a different form. So you had everything from citizen science data that was just, was there a sunflower star on this dive or not? That's one kind of data, all the way up to university scientists who would run a transect and count every single sunflower star they saw, how big it was, if it had disease. And so it was really about trying to figure out how to merge all those data sets together and what data could be used to answer what questions. You use presence absence data for certain things, you use density information for other things. And so we ended up kind of consolidating. The way we kind of did it is like we consolidated it into one giant data set that had a bunch of extra columns for extra information. And so we had everything there in one CSV file, but you could kind of subset it based on whether you were looking, does it have density info? Pull that data out. Does it have presence absence info? Pull that data out. So that was the way we did it. I think in the future might have been worthwhile. Something I didn't do at the time that I think might have been worthwhile would be to use Git to track changes and how we were in our data, because sometimes people would change things without communicating that across the group. And it was very hard to track where those changes were and how they occurred. So in the future, I would probably have used Git to kind of synchronize and keep track of all those changes to that enormous bloody data set.
Question says, from Giselini, great job, Sarah. So what is the next step for you regarding your awesome science and posting?
Yeah, so I will actually be starting a postdoc at UC Davis that I'm really excited about. It unfortunately takes me a bit away from kelp forests, but basically it draws on a lot of my skills to synthesize data and to map data over large areas. And the goal of it is to try to understand how changing ocean chemistry, so things like ocean acidification, dissolved oxygen, what are going to be the likely impacts on invertebrate-based fisheries and aquaculture, and how does that translate to social vulnerability? And basically, where up and down the West Coast are key invertebrate fisheries and aquaculture going to be most impacted by changing ocean chemistry? And so there's a lot of work with that. I'm super excited for that because I still get to do a lot of the cool science and a lot of the spatial stuff that I love. But I also get to, there's, a key part of it is communicating that to managers and thinking really specifically, how do we make maps and tools that managers all, from tribes, from state agencies, from federal agencies can use all up and down the West Coast for their local needs as well. So it'll take me a step more in the policy and applied management realm, which I'm really excited for.
Okay, so maybe we could have one more question. Those two up there are about your policy work. I could condense them to say what was one of the most challenging parts and one of the most rewarding parts, and then we'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know what the most challenging part about policy work is, because I just derive so much joy from being able to share and talk to other people about the things that I think are really interesting. And I mean, it's such a privileged position to be able to walk into a senator's Zoom room, nobody does anything in person anymore, and say I think you should really do this, or I think this is really important, and have them listen. So let me think, what's challenging about it? I mean, probably the most challenging part, but one of the things I really enjoy about that is constantly trying to understand what terms are easily accessible to the public and what terms are not, because we're so steeped in jargon all day long that we forget that terms that seem obvious to us are not. So that, that's something I'm constantly doing, and it is hard, but I really enjoy that part of it. It's almost like learning a second language. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah. This closes the public part of the defense. Now, Sarah and the committee will have another meeting, and then after that,
Let's also make it known that there is a gathering after the committee meets, Sarah, in our lab in Woodley Hall 5.